The late afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows of my childhood home, casting golden rectangles across the worn linoleum floor where I'd once spilled countless glasses of milk. I stood at the counter, methodically arranging store-bought cookies on my mother's good china platter, trying to ignore the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Family gatherings always did this to me, turned me back into that awkward teenager desperate for approval, no matter how successful my adult life had become. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah, honey, could you grab the good napkins from the dining room? Mom called from across the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular tone of controlled chaos that meant she was simultaneously proud of hosting and terrified something would go wrong. Of course, Mom. I smoothed down my carefully chosen outfit, a flowing maxi dress that covered everything I wanted hidden, and headed toward the dining room where the sounds of arriving relatives grew louder by the minute. The house buzzed with the energy of a Henderson family reunion, the first one we'd managed to coordinate in 3 years. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends filled every available space, their voices creating a symphony of catch-up conversations and nostalgic laughter. Children darted between adult legs, their shrieks of joy punctuating the steady hum of adult conversation. As I pulled the linen napkins from the china cabinet, I caught fragments of conversations drifting from the living room. Aunt Patricia's voice rose above the others as she regaled someone with stories about her latest cruise. Cousin Michelle was apparently engaged again, her 3rd time, and everyone was being appropriately enthusiastic about her chances this round. Sarah! Uncle Bob's booming voice caught me as I returned to the kitchen. There's our successful city girl. Come here and tell me about that fancy husband of yours. I forced a smile and accepted his bear hug, inhaling the familiar mixture of Old Spice and cigarettes that had defined Uncle Bob for as long as I could remember. David's great, Uncle Bob. He's actually running a bit late. Got called into surgery this morning. Surgery? Aunt Linda chimed in, appearing beside us with a wine glass already half empty. Must be nice being married to a doctor. All that money and he can fix anything that goes wrong with you. The comment hit harder than she probably intended, but I maintained my smile. Plastic surgery, actually. He mostly does reconstructive work. Oh, how wonderful, Mom interjected, joining our small circle. You know, Mrs. Patterson from down the street had that work done after her mastectomy. Such important work. It really is, I agreed, grateful for Mom's redirection. David's passion for helping people restore not just their appearance but their confidence after trauma was one of the things I loved most about him. He understood the deep connection between how we looked and how we felt about ourselves in ways that most people never considered. Sarah! My sister Emma's voice cut through the conversation as she burst through the back door with her 2 kids in tow. At 28, Emma was 3 years younger than me but had somehow managed to make motherhood look effortless. Her kids were perfectly dressed, well-behaved, and she herself looked like she'd stepped out of a parenting magazine despite having given birth to her 2nd child just 8 months ago. Emma! I opened my arms to receive hugs from my nephew Jake, who was 4, and little Lily, who was still in that adorable toddler stage where everything was a grand adventure. Aunt Sarah, Jake launched himself at me with the full force of his small body. Mommy said you might have presents. Jake! Emma laughed, though I caught the slight edge of embarrassment in her voice. We don't ask people for presents. It's okay, I assured her, ruffling Jake's hair. I might have something special in my car for later. As Emma settled in, more family members continued to arrive. The house filled with the particular chaos that only large family gatherings could create. Cousin Mark brought his new girlfriend, whom he introduced to everyone at least 3 times. Great Aunt Ruth held court in the corner chair, dispensing wisdom and complaints in equal measure. The younger cousins had claimed the basement, and their laughter drifted up through the floorboards. I found myself in the familiar role of helpful daughter, moving between the kitchen and living room, refilling drinks, passing appetizers, and making small talk with relatives I saw only at these occasions. It was comfortable in its familiarity, even if it also felt slightly suffocating. Sarah, remember when you used to help me with these parties when you were little? Mom said as we both arranged food on the dining room table. You were always such a good helper. I remember, I smiled at the memory. You'd let me arrange the crackers in perfect rows, and I thought I was doing the most important job in the world. You were, she said, squeezing my shoulder. You still are. The warmth in her voice made me grateful I'd made the drive down from the city. These moments with Mom, away from the complexity of extended family dynamics, reminded me why I valued these gatherings despite their challenges. So when are you and David going to give us some grandchildren? The question came from behind me, and I turned to see Aunt Patricia approaching with that particular smile that meant she thought she was being helpful. The question hit like a physical blow, just as it always did. I felt my carefully maintained composure waver for just a moment before I pulled it back together. We're just focusing on our careers right now, Aunt Patricia. Oh, but honey, you can't wait forever. You're 31 already, and these things get more complicated as you get older. Just look at your sister. 2 beautiful babies, and she makes it look so easy. Emma, who had been within earshot, gave me a sympathetic look. She knew the real story. Knew about the miscarriages, the fertility treatments, the crushing disappointment that had defined the last 3 years of my marriage. But she also knew this wasn't the time or place to share those details. Well, when it happens, I said lightly, hoping to close the conversation. You know, Aunt Linda joined in, apparently emboldened by her wine. My friend's daughter waited too long, and now she needs all sorts of medical intervention. Thousands of dollars. Of course, that wouldn't be a problem for you two, with David being a doctor and all. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but managed to keep my voice level. Every couple's journey is different. That's absolutely right, Emma said firmly, moving to stand beside me in a show of sisterly support. And speaking of journeys, shouldn't we get some pictures of everyone together? Mom, didn't you want to get that group photo while the light is still good? Bless Emma for her quick thinking. The suggestion successfully redirected everyone's attention, and soon we were all herded outside for the traditional family photo. As we finished our conversation, I realized something important had happened. I'd been able to celebrate my sister's joy while acknowledging my own grief, without either emotion canceling out the other. It felt like a kind of emotional maturity I hadn't possessed before. That evening, David and I went for our usual walk through the neighborhood. The late spring weather was perfect, warm but not humid, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming trees. How was the rest of your day? David asked as we strolled past the small park where neighborhood kids were playing on the playground equipment. Good, actually. I kept thinking about Emma's news, but it didn't derail me the way it might have before. That's significant progress. I think so too. I paused to watch a little girl, who couldn't have been more than 3, attempting to climb a ladder that was clearly too big for her, while her father spotted her carefully from below. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever think about what our life would look like if we'd been able to have children? David was quiet for a moment as we continued walking. Sometimes, he said finally. Do you? Less than I used to, but yes. I used to think about it obsessively, imagining what they would look like, what kind of parents we'd be, how our whole life would be different. And now? Now I think about it more like an alternate universe, something that might have been beautiful, but not something that makes this universe less valuable. David stopped walking and turned to face me. That's a remarkably healthy way to think about it. It doesn't always feel healthy, I admitted. Sometimes it still hurts. But the hurt doesn't feel like it's going to swallow me anymore. What changed? I thought about the question as we resumed walking. I think I stopped seeing our inability to have children as evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with me or our relationship. Now it just feels like unfortunate circumstances that we've learned to navigate together. That's a huge shift in perspective. It is. And honestly, I think it happened because you helped me learn to see myself as valuable independent of my reproductive function. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. As we turned the corner toward home, David spoke again. Can I share something with you? Of course. Quote. When we first started trying to have children, I think I was so focused on supporting you through the medical challenges that I didn't fully process my own grief about it. This was new territory. David had always been my rock during our fertility struggles, always focused on my emotional needs rather than his own. What do you mean? I asked gently. I wanted to be a father, David said simply. I had dreams about teaching a kid to ride a bike, helping with homework, passing on family traditions. When those dreams didn't materialize, I was sad too. But I felt like I needed to be strong for you, so I didn't really let myself grieve. "Oh, David," I said, feeling a pang of guilt that he'd been carrying his own pain while caring for mine. "It's not your fault," he said quickly, reading my expression. "I chose to handle it that way. But I think I'm finally ready to acknowledge that it was a loss for both of us, not just you. What does that feel like for you now?" "Sad, but also peaceful somehow. Like you said, it feels like an alternate universe that might have been beautiful, but that doesn't diminish the beauty of the universe we actually live in." I reached for David's hand as we walked. "I'm sorry you felt like you couldn't grieve too. That must have been lonely." "It was sometimes. But watching you heal, seeing you learn to value yourself independently of our fertility challenges, that's been its own kind of beautiful." "Thank you for taking care of me through all of it," I said, "even when it meant you couldn't take care of yourself." "Thank you for letting me," David replied. "And for doing the hard work of healing. It's made both of us stronger." As we reached our front door, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the conversation we just had. Emma's pregnancy announcement had stirred up old grief, but it had also revealed how much healing had taken place. Instead of being devastated by her news, I'd been able to feel genuinely happy for her, while also acknowledging my own sadness. And now David and I had been able to talk about our shared loss in a way that felt healthy and complete. "I love our life," I said, as David unlocked the front door. "Even without children?" "Especially without children," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "This life, with you exactly as it is, I wouldn't trade it for anything." David pulled me into his arms right there on our front porch. "I love our life too," he said, kissing me softly. "And I love the woman you've become through all of this." "Who have I become?" I asked curiously. "Someone who can hold joy and sorrow at the same time. Someone who can celebrate other people's happiness, even when it highlights their own losses. Someone who has learned that love isn't conditional on perfection." "That sounds like a person worth loving," I said. "The most worthwhile person I know," David confirmed. As we went inside and settled into our evening routine, I reflected on how much had changed since that family gathering where Aunt Patricia had made her inappropriate comments about my weight and fertility. Her words had stung because they'd echoed my own deepest fears about my worth and my body. But they'd also catalyzed something important. David's fierce defense of me, yes, but also my own journey towards self-acceptance. Now, faced with Emma's pregnancy news, I was able to respond from a place of emotional stability rather than raw grief. I could feel sad for my own losses while genuinely celebrating her joy. I could acknowledge the alternate universe where David and I had children, while fully embracing the universe we actually inhabited. The healing hadn't been linear or quick, but it had been real, and perhaps most importantly, it had brought David and me closer together rather than driving us apart. The evening settled into the comfortable rhythm of a family gathering as we moved back inside. David had been seamlessly absorbed into the group, his natural ability to connect with people serving him well. I watched from across the room as he engaged Uncle Bob in what appeared to be an animated discussion about sports, while simultaneously listening to Great Aunt Ruth's stories about her recent hip replacement. "He's very handsome," Cousin Michelle whispered to me as we stood near the appetizer table, "and so polite. You really lucked out." "Thanks," I said, accepting the compliment while feeling the familiar pang of gratitude that David had chosen me. Even after 6 years of marriage, I sometimes wondered what he saw in me. He was brilliant, successful, charming, and undeniably attractive. I was me. "How did you two meet again?" Michelle continued, apparently settling in for a longer conversation. "At a medical conference," I explained. I was working for a pharmaceutical company at the time, representing some new products. He was attending lectures on reconstructive techniques. The memory was crystal clear in my mind. I'd been nervous about my presentation, standing in the hotel conference room in my best professional suit, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. David had been in the third row, and I'd noticed him immediately, not just because he was attractive, but because he was genuinely engaged with the material. He asked thoughtful questions and took careful notes. Afterward, he'd approached me to discuss the research behind one of the products I'd presented. What was supposed to be a 5-minute professional conversation had turned into coffee, then dinner, then a weekend together when he extended his stay. That's so romantic, Michelle sighed. Meeting at work, like something out of a movie. It was pretty amazing, I agreed, watching David across the room. He caught my eye and winked, making me smile. And he's a plastic surgeon, Michelle continued. That must be so interesting. Does he ever work on celebrities? Sometimes, but he can't really talk about it. Patient confidentiality and all that. This was true, though David's practice focused much more on reconstructive work than cosmetic enhancement. He'd built his reputation helping people recover from accidents, cancer surgeries, and birth defects, rather than creating Instagram faces. Still, it must be amazing being married to someone who can just fix things. I mean, if you ever wanted anything adjusted or improved. The comment stung more than Michelle probably intended. I'd heard variations of it countless times over the years, usually delivered with the assumption that being married to a plastic surgeon meant I had access to some kind of physical perfection. What people didn't understand was that David had never once suggested I needed fixing. He'd married me exactly as I was. David doesn't see me as a project, I said, trying to keep my tone light. Oh, of course not, Michelle backtracked quickly. I just meant it must be nice to have that option if you ever wanted it. Sarah, could you help me in the kitchen for a minute? Emma's voice provided a welcome interruption, and I excused myself from the conversation. In the kitchen, Emma was arranging desserts on a large tray, but I could tell she had something on her mind. You okay? She asked quietly. You looked a little overwhelmed out there. I'm fine, just the usual family gathering intensity. I picked up a plate of brownies and began transferring them to the dessert tray. You know how it is, quote. I do know how it is, which is why I wanted to check on you. Emma paused in her arranging and looked at me directly. I know some of the comments about kids and stuff can be hard. Emma was the only family member who knew about our struggles with fertility. She'd been my support system through the miscarriages, the failed IVF attempts, the crushing disappointment of negative pregnancy tests month after month. She'd held me while I cried after each loss and celebrated the small victories along the way. I'm managing, I said honestly. Having David here helps. And honestly, I'm just grateful everyone's together and healthy. That's very mature of you, Emma said with a slight smile. More mature than I would be if Aunt Patricia kept asking me about my reproductive timeline. Aunt Patricia means well, they all do. I arranged the last of the brownies on the tray. Besides, it's not like they know what we've been through. Maybe that's part of the problem, Emma said gently. If they knew... No, I shook my head firmly. I'm not ready for this to become a family discussion. Some things need to stay private. Emma nodded, understanding. Okay, but you know I'm here if you need anything tonight, right? Even if it's just a reason to escape to the kitchen. I know. Thank you. We carried the desserts back to the dining room, where the party was in full swing. Someone had put music on, and the younger kids were dancing in the living room while the adults clustered in small groups throughout the house. The noise level had increased considerably, creating that particular acoustic chaos that marked the peak of any Henderson family gathering. I found David in the corner with Dad and Uncle Mark, deep in conversation about something that had them all looking serious. As I approached, I caught the tail end of their discussion. Really impressive what they can do now, Dad was saying. Medical advances in just the last 10 years. It's incredible, David agreed. The techniques we use for reconstruction after trauma or cancer. We can give people their lives back in ways that weren't possible when I was in medical school. Must be very rewarding work, Uncle Mark said, though I imagine it's emotionally challenging too. It can be, David acknowledged. But seeing the difference it makes in people's lives, not just how they look, but how they feel about themselves, that makes all the challenging parts worthwhile. Quote, I felt that familiar surge of pride listening to David talk about his work. He genuinely cared about his patients, saw beyond the surface to understand how physical appearance affected every aspect of their lives. It was one of the many reasons I'd fallen in love with him. There's my wife, David said, noticing my approach and extending his arm to include me in the conversation. Did you guys know Sarah was instrumental in bringing some of the products I use to market? She has an amazing understanding of the science behind reconstructive techniques. The praise made me blush, but I also felt grateful for the way David always found opportunities to highlight my professional accomplishments. In a family where my career often got overshadowed by discussions of more traditional milestones like marriage and children, it meant a lot to have someone advocate for my professional identity. Sarah always was the smart one, Dad said proudly. Got that from her mother. Hey now, Mom called from across the room, having overheard. She got her work ethic from you. The easy family banter continued around us, and I found myself relaxing into the evening. This was the part of family gatherings I loved. The moments when everyone was comfortable, the conversations were flowing, and the stress of arrival and initial catch-ups had settled into genuine connection. Cousin Jake appeared at my elbow, tugging on my dress with the persistence that only 4-year-olds could muster. Aunt Sarah, will you come play with us? He asked, pointing toward the living room where several of the younger kids had set up some kind of elaborate game involving throw pillows and a lot of running. Of course, I said, letting him pull me toward the chaos. The next hour passed in a blur of children's games, photo opportunities, and the general pleasant exhaustion that came with trying to connect meaningfully with 20 different people in one evening. I found myself falling back into familiar family roles, helping Mom coordinate food, making sure the older relatives were comfortable, mediating minor disputes between cousins. David seemed to be enjoying himself, moving easily between different conversational groups and winning over family members with his combination of professional competence and genuine interest in their lives. I watched him listening intently to Great Aunt Ruth's stories about her garden, and felt grateful, not for the first time, that I'd married someone who understood the importance of family connections. As the evening wore on, someone suggested we move outside to enjoy the cooler air and the last light of the day. The back porch had always been the heart of Henderson family gatherings, with its collection of mismatched chairs and the old porch swing that had been there since my childhood. This is nice, David said quietly, settling beside me on the swing while conversations continued around us. Your family is wonderful. They can be a lot, I warned him, but I'm glad you're here. Me too. He reached over and took my hand, squeezing gently. How are you doing? I know these big gatherings can be overwhelming. I'm good, better now that you're here. I leaned against his shoulder, enjoying the momentary pocket of quiet intimacy in the midst of family chaos. Sarah, Aunt Linda's voice cut through our peaceful moment. Come settle an argument for us. I looked up to see a group of the women clustered near the porch railing, apparently engaged in some kind of heated discussion. Emma caught my eye and made a face that suggested I might want to avoid whatever controversy was brewing. What's the argument about? I asked, not moving from the swing. We're discussing whether modern women have it easier or harder than our generation, Aunt Patricia explained. Linda thinks you young women have all these advantages we didn't have, but I say you have pressures we never dealt with. Oh, definitely harder, Cousin Michelle chimed in. Social media alone makes everything more complicated. Everyone's life looks perfect online. But think about the opportunities, Aunt Linda countered. Sarah has a career, travels for work, has a successful husband. In my day, women didn't have those options. I felt the conversation shifting in a direction that made me uncomfortable, but I wasn't sure how to redirect it without seeming rude. Every generation has its challenges, I said diplomatically. I think we're all just doing our best with the circumstances we're given. That's very wise, Mom said approvingly. And speaking of doing our best, I think it's time for dessert. Who wants coffee? The suggestion successfully broke up the impromptu debate, and everyone began moving back toward the house. I started to follow, but Aunt Patricia caught my arm. Before we go in, she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, I wanted to ask you something personal. My stomach clenched. In my experience, nothing good ever followed that particular preamble from Aunt Patricia. I don't mean to pry, she continued, which always meant she absolutely intended to pry, but have you and David considered that maybe your weight might be affecting your fertility? I mean, I know you've been trying for a while now. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt David tense beside me, his hand tightening on mine. Aunt Patricia, I started, but she continued talking. I'm just saying, there are so many resources available now. Diet programs, personal trainers, even surgical options. And with David being a plastic surgeon, I'm sure he could help you explore all the possibilities. The blood roared in my ears. I was dimly aware of other conversations stopping, of family members turning to look at us. Emma appeared at my other side, her face flushed with anger. "That's completely inappropriate," Emma said firmly. "Sarah's weight has nothing to do with—" "I'm just trying to help," Aunt Patricia said defensively. "Sometimes people need to hear the truth, even if it's uncomfortable." "The truth," David said, his voice deadly quiet, "is that you don't know what you're talking about." I had never heard David use that tone before. It was professional, authoritative, and absolutely final. The porch fell completely silent. "Sarah's fertility challenges have nothing to do with her weight," he continued, standing up from the swing. "They're the result of endometriosis, a medical condition that affects approximately 10% of women of reproductive age. A condition that often goes undiagnosed for years, because people make assumptions about women's bodies instead of listening to their actual symptoms." Aunt Patricia's face went red. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't know. But that didn't stop you from making hurtful assumptions about my wife's body and our private medical situation." David's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Sarah is perfectly healthy, and her weight is absolutely none of your business." The silence stretched out uncomfortably. I felt exposed and mortified, but also protected in a way I'd never experienced before. David had just defended me in a way that left no room for argument or further commentary. "I think," Mom said carefully, "we should all go inside for dessert." Quote. As people began filing into the house, David turned to me with concern clear in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The combination of humiliation and gratitude was overwhelming. "We can leave if you want," he offered. "I can make an excuse." "No," I managed. "I don't want to ruin the evening for everyone else." "You're not ruining anything," Emma said fiercely. "Patricia is the one who should be embarrassed." David wrapped his arm around me protectively. "Whatever you want to do is fine with me. But I want you to know that everything I said was true. You are perfect exactly as you are." As we prepared to rejoin the family gathering, I realized something had shifted, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. For the first time in years, I had someone who would fight for me without hesitation, who saw my worth clearly and wasn't afraid to defend it. The evening was far from over, but I knew I would remember this moment. David standing up for me, choosing my dignity over family harmony, for the rest of my life. Dessert in the Henderson household had always been a production. Mom brought out her best china. There were at least 6 different options ranging from her famous apple pie to store-bought cookies arranged to look homemade. And everyone was expected to try a little of everything while complimenting the cook. Tonight, however, the usual enthusiastic atmosphere felt strained. I sat between David and Emma at the dining room table, hyper-aware of every glance and whispered conversation happening around me. Aunt Patricia had positioned herself as far from us as possible and was making an obvious effort to avoid eye contact. The rest of the family seemed to be working extra hard to maintain normal conversation, which only made the tension more obvious. "This apple pie is incredible, Mrs. Henderson," David said, taking another bite. "You'll have to share the recipe with Sarah." "Oh, it's my mother's recipe," Mom replied, seeming grateful for the safe topic. "Sarah's grandmother taught me to make it when I was first married. I keep meaning to write it down properly." "You should," I said, finding my voice again. "We could make it together next time David and I visit." "I'd love that," Mom said warmly, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. Conversation gradually returned to safer topics: work updates, vacation plans, funny stories about the kids. Jake had somehow managed to get chocolate frosting in his hair, which prompted a minor comedy routine involving Emma trying to clean him up while he insisted he was saving it for later. "Remember when Sarah did that?" Uncle Bob said, chuckling. "Must have been about Jake's age. Got into your mother's baking chocolate and ended up covered head to toe." "I remember that," Dad laughed. "She looked like a little chocolate monster. Your mother was furious, but I thought it was hilarious." "You always encouraged her messy phases," Mom said, but she was smiling at the memory. "Remember the finger painting phase? I found handprints on every wall in the house." The family storytelling continued, and I found myself relaxing despite the earlier confrontation. This was what I loved about family gatherings: the shared history, the way stories got told and retold until they became family mythology. Sarah was always getting into something, Emma added, but she was also the one who took care of everyone else. Even as a kid, she was always making sure everyone was okay. Still does that, David observed quietly, giving me a meaningful look. As the evening wound down, people began making departure preparations. Hugs were exchanged, plans were made for future visits, and the usual promises to stay in better touch were offered with varying degrees of sincerity. Aunt Patricia approached me as I was helping carry dishes to the kitchen, her expression uncertain. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I spoke out of turn earlier, and I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings." I appreciated the apology, even if it felt incomplete. "Thank you, Aunt Patricia. I know you meant well." "I did," she said earnestly. "I just worry about you sometimes. You seem to put so much pressure on yourself." There was truth in her observation, even if her earlier comments had been inappropriate. I did put pressure on myself to be successful professionally, to be a good daughter and sister, to be worthy of David's love, to become a mother despite my body's apparent refusal to cooperate. "I'm working on that," I said honestly. "Good," she said, squeezing my hand. "You're a wonderful young woman, and you deserve to be happy." As families began loading sleepy children into cars and saying final goodbyes, I found myself in the kitchen with Mom and Emma, falling into the familiar rhythm of post-party cleanup. "That went well," Mom said carefully, clearly testing the emotional temperature. "It did," I agreed. Aunt Patricia apologized. "She should have," Emma said firmly. What she said was completely out of line. "But she's not wrong about everything," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "I do put a lot of pressure on myself. Maybe too much." "We all do that sometimes," Mom said gently. "But you can't let other people's expectations define your worth." "Mom's right," Emma agreed. "And David was amazing tonight. The way he stood up for you. I've never seen anyone shut Patricia down that effectively." I smiled at the memory. "He was pretty impressive." "He loves you," Mom said simply. "Anyone can see that. The way he looks at you, the way he talks about you, that man adores you exactly as you are." The observation made my throat tight with emotion. "I know. Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve him." "You don't have to deserve love, sweetheart," Mom said, pulling me into a hug. "You just have to accept it." Later, as David and I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I found myself reflecting on the evening. The confrontation with Aunt Patricia had been mortifying, but David's response had been everything I didn't know I needed. "Thank you," I said quietly as we merged onto the highway. "For what?" "For defending me tonight? For standing up to Patricia? I struggled to find the right words. "For seeing me the way you do." David reached over and took my hand. "Sarah, you don't need to thank me for loving you. That's not a favor I'm doing you. It's a privilege I get to experience every day." "I know you feel that way intellectually," I said. "But sometimes I wonder if you ever look at me and think about how I could be better, different." David pulled the car over to the shoulder of the highway and put it in park. In the glow of the dashboard lights, his expression was serious. "Look at me," he said gently. I turned to face him fully. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," he said. "You are not a project. You are not something that needs to be fixed or improved or changed. You are the woman I fell in love with 6 years ago, and you are the woman I choose to love every single day. But surely there are things." "Sarah," his voice was firm but loving. "Do you trust me?" "Of course." "Then trust me when I tell you that I have never, not once, looked at you and thought you needed to be different. I look at you and think about how grateful I am that you chose me back." Quote. The sincerity in his voice broke through the defensive walls I'd built around my insecurities. I felt tears starting to form. "The fertility stuff is hard," I admitted. "And I know it's not about my weight, but sometimes I wonder if my body is just broken." "Your body is not broken," David said firmly. "You have a medical condition that affects millions of women. It's not your fault, it's not a reflection of your worth, and it's certainly not something you caused or deserved." "I know that logically." But knowing it logically and feeling it emotionally are different things, he finished. I get that. But I need you to know that I love every inch of you, exactly as you are. Your scars, your softness, your strength. All of it. The mention of scars made my stomach clench. I had several from the various procedures I'd undergone as part of our fertility journey, including a laparoscopy to treat endometriosis, and 2 C-sections from pregnancies that had ended in loss. They were thin, pale lines across my lower abdomen that I kept carefully hidden, even from David most of the time. The scars are ugly, I said quietly. No, they're not, David said immediately. I wiped away the tears that had started to fall. How do you always know the right thing to say? Because I mean every word, he said simply, and because I love you too much to let you believe lies about yourself. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the occasional car pass by on the highway. I felt something settling inside me, some knot of tension I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten it was there. I love you too, I said finally. I know you do, David replied, starting the car again. Now let's go home, it's been a long day. As we resumed the drive home, I thought about the evening's events. Aunt Patricia's comments had been hurtful and inappropriate, but they'd also led to something important. David's fierce defense of me, yes, but also my own recognition of how much I'd been carrying alone. Maybe it was time to stop hiding parts of myself, even from the person who loved me most. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of David moving around the kitchen. Our house in the city was a far cry from the comfortable chaos of my childhood home. All clean lines, modern fixtures, and carefully curated spaces. David had excellent taste, and our home reflected his aesthetic sensibilities in the best possible way. I found him at the kitchen island, still in his pajama pants and a t-shirt, reading something on his tablet while his coffee cooled beside him. Good morning, I said, padding over to pour myself a cup from the pot he'd already made. Morning, beautiful, he replied, looking up from his reading. How are you feeling after yesterday? Better, actually, I said, settling onto the stool beside him. I kept thinking about what you said in the car. Which part? All of it, but especially the part about not hiding from you. I took a breath, feeling nervous despite 6 years of marriage. I realized I do hide from you sometimes, parts of myself that I think are unacceptable. David set down his tablet and gave me his full attention. What do you mean? I looked down at my coffee mug, tracing the rim with my finger. My scars. I know you've seen them, but I always try to keep them covered or hidden. I change clothes in the bathroom. I wear pajamas to bed more than I used to. I position myself carefully when we're intimate. Sarah, let me finish, I said quickly. I know you said they don't bother you, and I believe you intellectually. But emotionally, I look at them and see everything that's gone wrong. Every failed pregnancy, every procedure that didn't work, every way my body has let us down. David was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Can I ask you something? He said finally. I nodded. When you look at me, do you see my flaws? The question surprised me. What flaws? Exactly, he said gently. You see me through the lens of love. That scar on my shoulder from when I fell off my bike as a kid? The slightly crooked nose from high school football? The fact that I'm going gray at 34? None of that matters to you because you love me as a complete person. I started to protest that those things were different, but he held up a hand. It's the same for me, he continued. When I look at you, I don't see flaws or imperfections. I see the woman who makes me laugh every day, who remembers my patients' names because she knows I care about them, who still gets excited about finding a good parking spot downtown. Your scars are just part of your story, not something separate from the person I love. But they represent failure, I said quietly. No, they represent courage, David corrected firmly. They represent your willingness to fight for our dreams, to endure pain and disappointment in pursuit of something we both wanted. That's not failure, that's heroism. I felt tears starting again and tried to blink them away. I have an idea, David said carefully. What if we made a different kind of morning routine? What do you mean? What if, instead of hiding from me, you let me show you how I really see you? His voice was gentle but serious. Not as a patient or a project, but as your husband, who thinks you're the most beautiful woman in the world. The suggestion made my heart race with a mixture of fear and longing. The idea of being truly seen, truly vulnerable, was terrifying but also appealing in a way I hadn't expected. I don't know if I'm ready for that, I admitted. That's okay, David said immediately. We don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. I just want you to know that when you are ready, I'm here. I looked at him across the kitchen island. This man who had chosen me, who defended me, who somehow saw beauty where I saw only disappointment. Maybe it was time to trust his vision of me, even if I couldn't see it myself yet. Okay, I said quietly. Maybe we could try. Are you sure? I nodded, not trusting my voice. David stood up slowly and walked around the island to where I sat. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. We'll go slow, he promised, and we stop whenever you want to stop. He led me upstairs to our bedroom, where morning light was streaming through the windows we'd forgotten to cover the night before. Our bed was still unmade from sleep, and the whole room had a soft, intimate quality that made me feel both nervous and safe. Sit down, David said gently, indicating the edge of the bed. I sat, and he knelt in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. I want to tell you what I see when I look at you, he said, but I need you to try to hear it, really hear it, instead of arguing with me in your head. I managed a small smile. I'll try. Good. David's eyes met mine steadily. When I look at your face, I see the woman who laughed at my terrible jokes on our first date, even though they weren't funny. I see the kindness in your eyes when you're worried about someone you care about. I see the determination that got you through graduate school and built your career. His hands moved to rest on my arms. When I look at your hands, I see the way you gesture when you're excited about something, the way you unconsciously play with your wedding ring when you're thinking, the gentleness when you touch me. I was crying now, but trying to stay present for his words. And when I look at your body, he continued, his voice growing softer, I see strength. I see resilience. I see the physical form of the person I love most in this world. David, I'm not finished, he said gently. I need you to understand something about those scars you hide from me. In my professional life, I see scars every day. I see them on people who've survived cancer, accidents, violence, genetic conditions. And you know what every single one of those scars represents? I shook my head. Survival, courage, the incredible capacity of the human body and spirit to endure and heal. His voice was intense now, professional and personal at the same time. But they're from failures, I whispered. They're from attempts, David corrected. They're proof that you tried. And trying, even when the outcome isn't what we hoped for, is never failure. I looked down at where his hands rested on my arms, steadying me. Can I show you something? He asked. I nodded. David stood and walked to his dresser, pulling out what looked like a medical journal. He came back and sat beside me on the bed. This is an article one published last year, he said, opening the journal, about the psychological impact of visible scarring on patient self-image and recovery outcomes. He showed me a page filled with before and after photos of his patients, people who had undergone reconstructive surgery after various traumas. Look at these before pictures, he said, not at the scars themselves, but at the expressions on their faces. I studied the photos. The patients all had different types of scarring from different causes, but there was something similar in their expressions, a guardedness, a withdrawal, as if they were trying to hide from the camera. Now look at the after photos, David said, turning the page. The physical scars were still visible in most cases, though improved, but the difference in the patient's expressions was dramatic. They looked confident, open, alive. The surgery helped, David explained. But what really transformed these people wasn't the reduction in visible scarring. It was learning to see themselves as whole, worthy people whose scars were just one part of their story. Quote, he closed the journal and looked at me seriously. You don't need surgery, Sarah. Your scars are barely visible, and they're certainly not disfiguring. What you need is to stop seeing yourself as damaged and start seeing yourself as resilient. How do I do that? I asked. You start by letting the people who love you see all of you, he said simply, You stop hiding. You trust that love is bigger than perceived imperfection. I sat quietly for a moment, processing his words. The idea of being fully visible, fully vulnerable, was still terrifying. But sitting there with David, seeing the absolute sincerity in his eyes, I felt something shifting. "Will you help me?" I asked. "With what?" "Learning to see myself the way you see me." David's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire expression. "It would be my honor." "I don't know how to start," I admitted. "We start with honesty," he said. "Complete honesty between us. No more hiding, no more shame about things that are just part of life." I took a deep breath. "Okay, but you have to be patient with me. This is scary." "I have all the time in the world," David assured me. "And Sarah, you're already braver than you think you are." Over the next few weeks, David and I began what he called the process of healing. Not physical healing, but the deeper work of learning to see myself through eyes of love rather than criticism. It wasn't a quick transformation, but rather a series of small moments and conversations that gradually shifted something fundamental in how I understood my own worth. The first breakthrough came on a Wednesday morning when I emerged from the shower and, instead of immediately reaching for my robe, caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. Instead of automatically focusing on my scars or perceived flaws, I found myself remembering David's words about seeing strength and resilience. "You're beautiful," came David's voice from behind me, and I realized he'd been watching from the doorway. Instead of covering myself or deflecting the compliment, I took a breath and tried to receive it. "Thank you," I said simply. "How does it feel to accept a compliment without arguing?" David asked, coming to stand behind me in the mirror. "Strange," I admitted, "but also good." "That's progress," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Small steps." The small steps continued throughout our daily life. David began pointing out moments when I was being unnecessarily critical of myself. When I apologized for my appearance after working out, when I made self-deprecating comments about my cooking, when I assumed his affection was somehow charitable rather than genuine. "You realize you just criticized yourself 3 times in the span of 2 minutes, he said one evening as we prepared dinner together. "I did?" "You apologized for your hair being messy, called yourself clumsy when you dropped the spatula, and said I was stuck with your cooking tonight." David paused in his chopping to look at me seriously. "What if you tried spending one entire day without saying anything negative about yourself?" The challenge was harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how automatic the self-criticism had become, how often I diminished myself in small ways throughout the day. But gradually I began to notice the pattern and interrupt it. At work, I started accepting praise from colleagues without deflecting it. When my boss complimented a presentation I'd given, instead of saying, "Oh, it was nothing," I said, "Thank you, I worked hard on it." When a client mentioned appreciating my attention to detail, I accepted the feedback instead of minimizing my contribution. The changes were small but significant. I began to feel more solid somehow, more present in my own life. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told David one evening as we walked through our neighborhood. "About my scars representing courage rather than failure." "What about it?" "I think I want to understand them better. From a medical perspective, I mean." I glanced at him sideways. "Would you be willing to explain them to me? Not as my husband, but as a doctor." David stopped walking and turned to face me. "Are you sure? That might be intense." "I'm sure. I think understanding the science might help me see them differently." That night, David brought home some medical textbooks and his laptop. We spread everything out on the dining room table, and he began explaining the procedures I'd undergone with the same professional thoroughness he'd use with a medical student. "This incision," he said, showing me a diagram that matched my laparoscopy scar, "is specifically designed to minimize tissue damage while providing optimal surgical access. The placement and technique represent years of refinement to achieve the best possible outcomes." Quote, he showed me before and after photos from medical journals, explained the healing process, walked me through the specific challenges my surgeons had faced. "Your surgical team chose the most advanced, least invasive techniques available," he explained. "These scars represent excellence in medical care, not failure in your body." "But the pregnancies still ended," I said quietly. "Yes, they did. But not because of anything you did wrong. or any failure on your part. Sometimes, despite excellent medical care and bodies that are doing everything right, pregnancies aren't viable. It's devastating, but it's not a reflection of personal failure. David pulled up statistics about pregnancy loss, about endometriosis, about the various factors that affected fertility. Seeing the numbers, understanding the medical realities, helped contextualize our experience in a way that felt less personal and more simply unfortunate. "Does this help?" David asked as we closed the books. "It does," I said, surprised by how much. "It makes me feel less like my body betrayed me, and more like we encountered a medical challenge that we handled as well as anyone could." "That's exactly what happened," David confirmed. "You were incredibly brave throughout all of it." A few days later, I found myself looking at my scars in the bathroom mirror with something approaching curiosity rather than shame. They were thin, pale lines that told a story of medical intervention and healing. When I touched them, instead of feeling disappointed, I found myself thinking about the skilled surgeons who had placed them, the care that had gone into every aspect of my treatment. "I think I'm ready for the next step," I told David that evening. "What's the next step?" "I want to stop hiding them from you," I said, completely. David set down his book and gave me his full attention. "What does that look like for you?" "I want to be comfortable being naked around you. I want to stop strategically positioning myself, or changing in the bathroom, or wearing extra clothes to bed." I took a breath. "I want to trust that you really do see me the way you say you do." "I do see you that way," David said softly. "But this has to be about what you're ready for, not about what I want." "I know, and I think I'm ready." That night, for the first time in years, I changed into my pajamas in our bedroom instead of the bathroom. It was a small act, but it felt significant. David noticed but didn't make a big deal of it, which somehow made it feel even more meaningful. Over the following week, I found myself gradually becoming more comfortable with physical intimacy without the layers of self-consciousness I'd been carrying. David's consistent, genuine appreciation for my body began to override my own critical voice. "You know what I realized?" I said one morning as we lay in bed, sunlight streaming through the windows. "What's that?" "I've been robbing us both by hiding parts of myself. By being so focused on my perceived flaws, I wasn't fully present for the love you were offering me." David propped himself up on his elbow to look at me. "You weren't robbing anyone, you were protecting yourself in the way you knew how." "Maybe, but I don't want to need that protection anymore, at least not from you." "Good," David said, leaning down to kiss me softly, "because I love all of you, and I want all of you to know that." The conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with what sounded like an urgent message. He glanced at it and frowned. "Emergency?" I asked. "Possibly. Mrs. Chen, remember the patient I told you about who was in the car accident? She's having complications with her grafts." David was already reaching for his clothes. "I need to go in." "Of course," I said, sitting up. "Do what you need to do." As David prepared to leave for the hospital, I found myself thinking about his patients and the work he did. I'd always been proud of his career, but our recent conversations had given me a deeper appreciation for the psychological aspects of reconstructive surgery. "David," I called as he was gathering his keys, "when you get back, would you tell me more about your work? Not just the technical aspects, but the emotional side." "Why the interest?" "I think understanding how you help other people heal might help me understand my own healing process." David paused in his preparations to come back and kiss me goodbye. "I'd love to share that with you. You might be surprised by how much you already understand about the healing process." After he left, I spent the morning reflecting on the changes that had occurred over the past few weeks. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but it had been real. I felt more solid in my own skin, more deserving of love, more present in my relationship with David. When my phone rang and Emma's name appeared on the screen, I answered with a genuine smile. "Hey, sister. How are you?" "I'm good," Emma said, and then paused. "You sound different. Happier." "I feel different," I admitted. "David and I have been working through some things." "Good things?" "Very good things. I think I'm finally learning to see myself the way he sees me." "That's wonderful," Emma said warmly. "You deserve to feel good about yourself, Sarah. You always have." "I'm starting to believe that," I said, and realized it was true. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. Instead of automatically focusing on perceived flaws, I found myself thinking about David's descriptions of what he saw when he looked at me. I thought about the courage he saw in my scars, the strength he saw in my body, the beauty he saw in my complete self. For the first time in years, when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone worth loving. David returned from the hospital late that afternoon, looking tired but satisfied. Mrs. Chen's complications had been manageable, and her recovery was back on track. As he settled into his chair with a cup of coffee, I realized this might be the perfect opportunity to learn more about the emotional aspects of his work. "How is Mrs. Chen doing?" I asked, curling up on the couch beside him. "Much better. The infection was responding to treatment, and the grafts are integrating well." David rubbed his eyes tiredly. "She was worried the scarring would be worse than we'd discussed, but I think she'll be pleased with the final results." "What's her story?" I asked. "If you can share it." David considered for a moment. "She's 42, has 3 kids. She was driving home from her daughter's soccer practice when someone ran a red light and hit her driver's side door. She had extensive facial lacerations and some damage to her left arm. That's terrible. It was a significant trauma, both physically and emotionally. When I first met her, she was so focused on how the scars would look that she wasn't fully engaging with her physical therapy or her overall recovery. I thought about my own focus on scars and felt a pang of recognition. What did you do? Well, first I explained the medical side, what the healing process would look like, what techniques we'd use to minimize visible scarring, what the realistic outcomes were. But then I realized that her real concern wasn't actually about the scars themselves. What was it about? David set down his coffee and turned to face me more fully. She was afraid her husband wouldn't find her attractive anymore. She was afraid her kids would be scared of how she looked. She was afraid that the accident had changed not just her appearance, but her fundamental worth as a person. The parallels to my own experience were striking. How did you help her with that? I started by validating her concerns. These fears aren't vanity. They're about identity, about belonging, about how we fit into our relationships and our world. Then I began showing her examples of other patients who'd had similar injuries and recovered completely, not just physically, but emotionally. David pulled out his phone and showed me some before and after photos from his patient files, with faces obscured for privacy. This woman was in a similar accident 2 years ago, he said, showing me images of extensive facial scarring that had healed to barely visible lines. But look at this photo from her follow-up appointment. The final photo showed a woman who was clearly confident and happy, laughing at something off camera. The scars were there if you looked for them, but they didn't define her appearance. What made the difference for her? I asked. Time, excellent medical care, and most importantly, learning to see herself as a whole person whose value wasn't determined by her appearance. David paused thoughtfully. But also having people in her life who consistently reflected back her worth and beauty. Like her family? Exactly. Her husband was incredible throughout her recovery. He kept telling her she was beautiful, kept treating her like the same person he'd always loved, kept refusing to let her define herself by her injuries. I felt a warm recognition spreading through my chest. That sounds familiar. David smiled. I thought it might. The situations are different, but the emotional process is very similar. Tell me more about that process, I said, from a professional perspective. David shifted into what I recognized as his teaching mode, the clear, systematic way he explained complex concepts to medical students and residents. Recovery from any trauma that affects appearance typically goes through several stages, he began. First, there's often shock and denial. The person can't quite believe this has happened to them. Then comes a period of intense focus on the physical damage, measuring scars, comparing to how they used to look, researching every possible treatment option. This felt very familiar. I thought about the hours I'd spent examining my own scars, researching scar reduction techniques, obsessing over every detail of my appearance. After that, David continued, there's usually a period of social withdrawal. The person becomes convinced that others are staring at them, judging them, finding them unattractive or damaged. They start avoiding situations where they feel exposed. And then? This is where it gets interesting, David said, his voice becoming more animated. The people who recover most completely are usually the ones who have strong support systems that consistently challenge their negative self-perception. When the people around you refuse to treat you as damaged, it becomes harder to maintain that self-image. But what if you can't see what they see? I asked. What if you genuinely believe you're damaged, even when people tell you otherwise? That's where professional help can be valuable, David said. Sometimes we need objective perspectives to help us recognize our own cognitive distortions. But often the most powerful healing happens through repeated experiences of unconditional acceptance. Repeated experiences? Yes, one conversation, one moment of reassurance isn't usually enough to override years of negative self-perception. But when someone consistently, repeatedly shows you that they see you as valuable and beautiful exactly as you are, eventually that external voice starts to become internalized. I thought about the past few weeks with David, his patient responses to my insecurities, his consistent affirmations, his refusal to let me diminish myself in his presence. Is that what you've been doing with me? I asked. David reached over and took my hand. I've been loving you. The healing part is something you've been doing yourself. It doesn't feel like I've been doing anything special. You've been willing to be vulnerable with me. You've been willing to question your assumptions about yourself. You've been willing to consider that maybe your self-perception isn't entirely accurate. David squeezed my hand. That takes tremendous courage. Tell me about the end of the process, I said. What does complete healing look like? Well, scars never disappear completely, David said carefully. The goal isn't to pretend trauma never happened or to achieve some impossible standard of physical perfection. The goal is integration. Integration? Quote, learning to see your scars, your experiences, your challenges as part of your story rather than the defining feature of your identity. Learning to understand that resilience and beauty aren't mutually exclusive. David stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down a leather-bound photo album I'd seen but never looked through. These are some of my long-term patients, he said, settling back beside me. People I've worked with over multiple years, through their entire healing process. He opened the album to show me photos spanning months or years of recovery. In each case, the progression was remarkable, not just in terms of physical healing, but in the confidence and joy visible in the patients' faces. This man was in an industrial accident that severely burned his hands and arms, David said, showing me a series of photos. In the early pictures, he's clearly devastated, withdrawn. By the final photos, he's demonstrating how he's learned to play guitar again, despite limited mobility in some fingers. He looks so happy in the last photo. He is happy, not because his scars disappeared, they didn't, but because he learned that his value as a person wasn't determined by having perfect hands. He found ways to do the things he loved, and he surrounded himself with people who valued him for who he was, not how he looked. David showed me several more examples, each one a story of someone who had learned to integrate their physical challenges into a life of meaning and joy. The common thread, David explained, is that all of these people reached a point where they stopped seeing themselves as fundamentally damaged. They started seeing themselves as people who had experienced something difficult and come through it. How do you know when someone has reached that point? I asked. They stop apologizing for their appearance. They stop hiding. They start talking about their future plans, instead of focusing exclusively on their past trauma. David looked at me meaningfully. They start accepting compliments without arguing. I laughed, recognizing my own recent progress. I have been getting better at that. You have. And you've also stopped automatically covering your scars when you're around me. You've started wearing clothes you like instead of clothes that hide your body. You've started trusting that I see you clearly. I'm starting to trust that, I agreed. But I think I still have work to do. Healing isn't linear, David said gently. There will be good days and harder days. The goal isn't perfection, it's progress. As we sat together looking through the album, I felt profoundly grateful for David's work and his willingness to share it with me. Understanding the science and psychology behind healing had helped me see my own process more clearly. Can I ask you something? I said as David closed the album. Always. Do you ever worry that being married to someone like me, someone with fertility challenges, someone who struggles with self-image, affects your ability to help your patients? David was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering his answer carefully. Actually, he said finally, I think it makes me a better doctor. How? Because I understand, in a very personal way, what it feels like to watch someone you love struggle with self-acceptance. I understand the helplessness of wanting to make someone see themselves the way you see them. I understand how trauma affects not just the person who experiences it, but everyone who loves them. David paused, gathering his thoughts. When I work with patients now, I don't just focus on the medical aspects of their care. I think about their families, their relationships, their support systems. I spend time helping their loved ones understand how to be most helpful during the recovery process. That must make a real difference for families. I think it does, and selfishly, it helps me process my own experiences too. Every time I help a patient learn to see themselves as whole and valuable, I remember that the same is true for you. I felt tears starting to form at the unexpected emotional connection between David's professional and personal life. I love you, I said simply. I love you too, David replied. And Sarah? You've helped me be better at my job, better at understanding people, better at being human. You haven't been a burden in our relationship. You've been a gift. As evening settled around us, I found myself thinking about the interconnectedness of healing, how David's work with his patients informed his understanding of my own struggles, how my journey toward self-acceptance gave him insights that helped other people, how love and professional expertise could combine to create something powerful and transformative. I was beginning to understand that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken, but about learning to see wholeness and beauty in complexity, in imperfection, in the full reality of human experience. We're deep into this incredible story now, and I hope you're as captivated as I am by these unfolding events. The amount of effort that goes into researching, writing, and narrating these novel-length stories is immense. We're talking about creating content equivalent to a published book. But it's worth it to bring you stories that truly engage and transport you to another world. If you're enjoying this journey so far, please take a second to like this video and share it with friends who appreciate great storytelling. Your support means everything and helps us continue creating these detailed, epic narratives. We still have so much more to discover together, so let's see how this situation unfolds. 3 weeks after our conversation about David's work, I felt like I was living in a different version of my life. The change wasn't dramatic. I still went to work, still worried about deadlines, still occasionally caught myself being self-critical. But something fundamental had shifted in how I moved through the world. I was getting dressed for work on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang. Emma's name on the screen brought an automatic smile to my face. Hey, what's up? I answered, putting the call on speaker as I finished applying my makeup. I have news, Emma said, her voice containing an excitement that immediately got my attention. Good news or bad news? Very good news, but also kind of overwhelming news. I paused in my morning routine, giving her my full attention. What's going on? I'm pregnant again, Emma said, the words rushing out in a flood of excitement and anxiety. We weren't really trying, but we weren't preventing either, and apparently Lily decided she wanted a sibling sooner rather than later. The news hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there holding my phone while emotions crashed over me in waves. Sarah? Emma's voice was cautious now. Are you there? I'm here, I managed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Congratulations, that's wonderful news. Thank you, Emma said quietly. I wanted you to hear it from me before Mom starts calling everyone. Of course. How far along are you? About 8 weeks. We found out yesterday, but I wanted to wait until after the first appointment to start telling people. 8 weeks. The same gestational age I'd reached twice before losing pregnancies. I felt that familiar twist of grief and longing in my chest, but underneath it was something new. A genuine happiness for my sister that existed alongside my own pain. Are you okay? Emma asked gently. I know this might be difficult timing for you. I'm okay, I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it, at least partially. I'm happy for you and Mark, really. You don't have to pretend with me, Emma said. I know this is complicated. It is complicated, I admitted, but that doesn't mean I'm not happy for you. Both things can be true at the same time. We talked for a few more minutes about Emma's symptoms, her due date, her plans for telling the kids. Throughout the conversation, I found myself experiencing a strange duality. Genuine joy for my sister, mixed with a profound sadness for my own losses. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and let myself feel the full weight of the emotions Emma's news had stirred up. The familiar grief was there, but it felt different somehow. Less consuming, less defining. I was sad about my own fertility struggles, but I wasn't drowning in that sadness the way I had in the past. Sarah? David's voice came from the hallway. Everything okay? You missed your usual departure time. I looked at the clock and realized I'd been sitting there for 15 minutes. Emma's pregnant again, I said when David appeared in the doorway. His expression immediately shifted to one of concern and understanding. How are you feeling about that? Complicated, I said honestly. Happy for her, sad for us, guilty about feeling sad when I should just be happy. David sat down beside me on the bed. Those all sound like normal, healthy responses to complicated news. Do they? Absolutely. You can love your sister and be excited for her new baby while also grieving your own losses. Those emotions don't cancel each other out. I leaned against David's shoulder, grateful for his steady presence. I keep thinking I should be over the fertility stuff by now. We haven't been actively trying for almost a year. Grief doesn't work on a timeline, David said gently, and this isn't just about fertility. It's about dreams you had, futures you imagined, expectations you had to let go of. That's significant loss, and it's okay to still feel sad about it sometimes. But I also feel genuinely happy for Emma, I said. Is that weird? Not at all. It means you're healing. A year ago, would you have been able to feel happiness for someone else's pregnancy alongside your own sadness? I thought about it honestly. Probably not. I would have been too consumed with my own pain. So this is actually progress, David pointed out. You're able to hold multiple emotions at once, instead of being overwhelmed by just one. The observation helped me reframe what I was experiencing. Instead of seeing my mixed emotions as a failure to be properly supportive of my sister, I could see them as evidence of my own emotional growth. I should probably call her back, I said. Make sure she knows I'm genuinely happy for her. Do you want to be late for work? David asked. I can call your office if you need more time to process this. I considered the offer, but realized I actually felt okay to proceed with my normal day. Sad, yes, but not incapacitated by the sadness. I think I'm okay, I said, but thank you for offering. Call me if you need anything, David said, kissing the top of my head. And Sarah, I'm proud of how you're handling this. At work, I found myself thinking periodically about Emma's news, but I was able to focus on my tasks without being consumed by grief. During my lunch break, I called Emma back. I wanted to call you again, I said when she answered. I realized I might have sounded a little overwhelmed earlier, and I wanted to make sure you knew how excited I am for you. You sounded fine, Emma assured me, but I appreciate the call. I was worried about how to tell you. You handled it perfectly, and I meant what I said. I really am happy for you, even though it also makes me a little sad for my own situation. That makes complete sense, Emma said. I would feel the same way if our situations were reversed. Can I ask you something? I said, settling into a chair in the break room where I could have some privacy. Of course. How are you feeling about having 3 kids? Are you nervous? Emma laughed, terrified. Jake and Lily are just getting to where they're both sleeping through the night consistently, and now we're going to start over with newborn schedules. But also excited. I think they'll love having a little sibling. They will, I said, thinking about how gentle Jake was with Lily, how naturally he'd taken to being a big brother. You're amazing at this, Emma. I don't feel amazing at it most days, Emma said honestly. I feel like I'm barely keeping up, but I guess that's normal. It is normal. And you make it look effortless even when it doesn't feel that way. Thank you, Emma said softly. That means a lot. Over the next few days, Emma's pregnancy news seemed to create ripple effects throughout our extended family. Mom called me 3 times to share her excitement about becoming a grandmother again. each conversation including some variation of, "Maybe this will inspire you and David to try again soon." Aunt Patricia sent a card congratulating Emma and including a subtle note about how these things tend to come in waves in families. I found myself handling these conversations with an equanimity that surprised me. Instead of feeling defensive or hurt by the implied pressure, I was able to redirect the conversations to focus on Emma's excitement and the family's joy about the new baby. "You're handling this really well," David observed on Friday evening as I hung up from yet another family call. "I feel like I'm handling it well," I agreed. It's strange. 6 months ago, all these conversations would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and grief. What's different now? I thought about the question while David finished preparing dinner. We'd fallen into a comfortable Friday night routine of cooking together and catching up on the week. "I think the difference is that I know my worth isn't dependent on whether or not I have children," I said finally. "I'm sad that we haven't been able to have kids, but I don't feel like that makes me a failure as a woman or a wife." That's huge progress. It is. And honestly, it's freed up emotional energy to focus on other things. I paused in my salad making to look at David seriously. "I've been thinking about something and I wanted to run it by you." "What's that?" "I want to get more involved in your work. Not as a patient, but as someone who understands both the medical and emotional aspects of recovery from trauma." David set down his knife and gave me his full attention. "What are you thinking specifically?" "I've been reading about patient advocacy and support programs in plastic surgery practices. Some of your patients might benefit from talking to someone who's been through their own journey with self-acceptance and healing." "You want to be a patient advocate?" "I want to explore the possibility," I said carefully. "I know I'd need training, and I'd want to make sure I was actually helpful, rather than just projecting my own experiences onto other people's situations." Quote. David was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the implications. "I think that could be incredibly valuable," he said finally, "both for patients and for you. But I want to make sure you're considering it for the right reasons." "What do you mean?" "I want to make sure this is about your genuine interest in helping people, not about trying to find purpose to compensate for not having children." The question was gentle but pointed, and I appreciated David's willingness to ask it directly. "That's a fair concern," I said. "I've been thinking about that too. But honestly, I think my interest in this comes from a place of strength rather than compensation. I feel like I have something valuable to offer because of what I've learned about healing and self-acceptance." "What would this look like practically?" "I'd start by getting certified in patient advocacy through one of the professional organizations. Then maybe I could work with some of your patients who are struggling with the emotional aspects of their recovery." David nodded thoughtfully. "There are definitely patients who could benefit from that kind of support. Mrs. Chen, for example. She's doing well physically, but she's still struggling with self-image issues." "Exactly. I feel like I could help people understand that healing is about more than just physical recovery." "Would you want to do this as part of my practice, or independently?" "I hadn't thought that far ahead," I admitted. "I guess I was hoping you'd help me figure out the best approach." "Let me do some research," David said. "I'll look into certification programs and see how other practices have incorporated patient advocates. But Sarah, I think this is a wonderful idea." The validation meant everything to me. This wasn't just David being supportive of his wife's whims. This was his professional assessment that I had something valuable to contribute. Over dinner, we continued discussing the possibilities. David told me about several patients who might benefit from advocacy support, and I shared some of the research I'd already begun into certification programs. "There's a conference next month in Chicago about integrative approaches to plastic surgery recovery," David said. "It covers both medical and psychological aspects. Would you be interested in attending with me?" "Really? You'd want me there?" "I'd love to have you there. It would give you a chance to learn about the field from a professional perspective, and it would help me understand how to best incorporate advocacy services into the practice." The idea of attending a medical conference as David's professional partner rather than just his wife felt both exciting and intimidating. "I'd love to do that," I said. "Good. I'll register both of us tomorrow." As we cleaned up after dinner, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The prospect of channeling my experiences into something helpful for other people felt meaningful and purposeful. "Can I ask you something?" I said as we loaded the dishwasher. "Of course." "Do you think I'm strong enough to handle hearing about other people's trauma without it overwhelming me?" David paused in his cleaning to look at me directly. "I think you're one of the strongest people I know. You've faced your own trauma with courage, you've done the hard work of healing, and you've come through it with empathy and wisdom. That's exactly what makes someone effective in this kind of work." "But what if I get too emotionally involved? What if someone's story triggers my own issues?" "Those are good questions to consider," David said. "That's why the training programs exist, to help advocates learn how to maintain appropriate boundaries while still being genuinely helpful." "And you think I can learn those skills?" "I think you already have many of those skills. You've been supportive to Emma through her pregnancies without letting it completely derail your own emotional stability. You've been able to hear about my patients' challenges without taking on their pain as your own. You've learned to separate empathy from enmeshment." I hadn't thought about it that way, but David was right. Over the past few months, I had developed better emotional boundaries without losing my capacity for compassion. That night, as I researched patient advocacy certification programs online, I felt more excited about my future than I had in years. The work would be challenging, but it would also be meaningful in a way that felt aligned with who I was becoming. "Find anything interesting?" David asked, settling into bed beside me with his own laptop. "Several programs look promising. There's one through the American Association of Patient Advocates that has a specialization in surgical recovery support." "That sounds perfect." "What are you working on?" I asked, noticing David was reviewing what looked like patient files. "I'm preparing for a consultation next week. A young woman who was in a house fire. She has extensive scarring on her arms and chest. She's only 23, and she's struggling with whether or not to pursue reconstructive surgery." "What's the struggle?" "She's afraid the surgery will leave her with different scars that might be just as noticeable. But she's also afraid that not having surgery means accepting a level of visible scarring that affects her confidence and her relationships." I could hear the compassion in David's voice as he described his patient's dilemma. "That sounds like exactly the kind of situation where patient advocacy could be helpful," I said. "It really is. Someone who could help her think through the emotional aspects of her decision, who could connect her with other patients who face similar choices, who could help her understand that her worth isn't dependent on her appearance regardless of what she decides about surgery." "Would you want me to meet with her if I get certified?" "If she was interested in that kind of support, absolutely," David said. "But that's still a few months away, assuming you start a certification program soon." "I'm going to apply to the AAPA program next week," I said decisively. "I think I'm ready for this." David closed his laptop and turned to face me fully. "I'm proud of you," he said seriously. 6 months ago, you were so focused on what you couldn't do, what your body couldn't accomplish, what was missing from your life. Now you're focused on what you can contribute, how you can help other people, how you can use your experiences to make a difference. "I had a good teacher," I said, reaching for his hand. "You had the capacity for growth all along. I just helped you remember that you're worth investing in." As we turned off the lights and settled into sleep, I felt profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. Emma's pregnancy news, which could have devastated me, had instead revealed how much I'd healed. And now that healing was opening up new possibilities for purpose and meaning that I never could have imagined when I was consumed by grief and self-doubt. The future felt full of potential in a way it hadn't for years. The patient advocacy certification program was more rigorous than I'd expected, but in the best possible way. Over the next 8 weeks, I attended evening classes twice a week, studying everything from medical ethics to communication techniques to crisis intervention. My classmates were a diverse group: former patients who wanted to help others navigate similar challenges, healthcare professionals transitioning to advocacy roles, and people like me who had discovered a calling through personal experience. "How's the coursework going?" David asked one evening as I spread study materials across our dining room table. "Challenging but incredible," I said, looking up from a case study about a burn victim's recovery journey. "I'm learning so much about the psychology of trauma and healing that I wish I'd known when I was going through my own struggles." "Like what?" like how common it is for people to experience what they call ambiguous loss, grief for things that never happened or might have been different. The instructor said it's particularly common in fertility challenges, chronic illness, and disfiguring injuries. David sat down across from me at the table. That describes a lot of what you went through. Exactly. And learning that it's a recognized psychological phenomenon, that there are specific techniques for processing it, that's been really validating. How so? It makes me feel less like I was being overly dramatic about our fertility struggles, and more like I was having a normal human response to a genuinely difficult situation. David reached across the table to squeeze my hand. You were never being overly dramatic. I know that now. But at the time, I felt like I should have been able to just accept our circumstances and move on. Learning about ambiguous loss helped me understand why that wasn't realistic. Are you finding the coursework emotionally difficult? I considered the question. Some of the case studies were heartbreaking, and several class discussions had touched on experiences very similar to my own. Sometimes, I said honestly, but not in a way that feels overwhelming. It's more like productive difficulty, like I'm processing my own experiences more completely by learning how to help other people process theirs. That sounds healthy. It feels healthy. And the instructors are really good about helping us maintain boundaries while still being genuinely helpful. The program covered everything from basic counseling techniques to healthcare system navigation to legal advocacy. I was particularly drawn to the modules about supporting people through medical decision-making and recovery processes. I think I want to specialize in surgical recovery support, I told David one evening after a particularly engaging class about post-operative psychological care. What appeals to you about that specifically? The intersection of physical and emotional healing. Understanding how appearance affects self-image. How to support people through the vulnerability of medical procedures. How to help them integrate their experiences into their sense of identity. That makes sense given your own experience and your understanding of my work. Plus, I think I'd be good at it. I understand what it feels like to be self-conscious about your body, to feel like medical procedures are invasive or exposing, to struggle with whether or not you're making the right decisions about treatment. David smiled. You would be excellent at it. The Chicago conference David had mentioned was scheduled for the following month, right after I would complete my certification program. As the date approached, I found myself both excited and nervous about attending as David's professional colleague rather than just his wife. What should I expect at this conference? I asked David one evening as we reviewed the agenda together. A mix of medical presentations, case studies, panel discussions, and networking opportunities. There will be plastic surgeons, psychiatrists, social workers, patient advocates, and other professionals who work in reconstructive medicine. Will I be able to follow the medical presentations? Some of them will be very technical, but many will focus on patient outcomes and psychosocial factors that are directly relevant to advocacy work. David showed me the session descriptions, highlighting ones he thought would be most interesting to me. This panel about supporting families through pediatric reconstructive surgery looks excellent, he said. And this presentation about body image and identity in adult patients could be very relevant to your future work. I'm nervous about the networking parts, I admitted. What if people ask about my background and I don't sound qualified? You are qualified, David said firmly. You have lived experience with medical trauma and recovery, you're completing professional training in patient advocacy, and you have a deep understanding of the emotional aspects of medical care. That's exactly the kind of background that's valuable in this field. But I don't have years of experience working with patients. Neither did anyone else when they started. What you have is authenticity, training, and genuine compassion. That's more valuable than years of going through the motions. The night before we left for Chicago, I was packing when I caught sight of myself in the bedroom mirror. Instead of automatically focusing on perceived flaws or thinking about what I was wearing to hide parts of my body, I found myself thinking about the confidence I'd been building through my advocacy training. You look professional, David said, noticing me examining my reflection. I feel professional, I said, surprised by the truth of it. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm becoming someone I'm proud to be. You've always been someone to be proud of, David said, but I'm glad you're starting to see it too. The conference in Chicago exceeded my expectations in every way. The presentations were fascinating, the other attendees were welcoming and inclusive, and I found myself engaged in substantive conversations about patient care and advocacy throughout the 3-day event. This research about post-surgical depression is incredible, I told David during a break between sessions. I had no idea how common it was or how significantly it could affect recovery outcomes. It's one of the reasons I think having advocates like you involved in patient care is so important, David replied. Medical professionals are good at treating the physical aspects of recovery, but we often miss the emotional components. That presentation about peer support programs was fascinating too. The woman who spoke about her experience as a burn survivor turned advocate. Her work sounds exactly like what I want to do. During the lunch break, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Martinez, a psychiatrist who specialized in medical trauma recovery. David tells me you're completing patient advocacy certification with a focus on surgical recovery, she said. What drew you to this field? I gave her the condensed version of my story, my own experience with medical procedures, my journey toward self-acceptance, and my desire to help other people navigate similar challenges. That kind of lived experience is invaluable, Dr. Martinez said. Some of my most effective colleagues are people who've been through similar experiences to their patients. Quote, do you think that's enough? Experience and training, but no formal medical background? Absolutely. In fact, sometimes formal medical training can be a barrier to the kind of empathetic support that patients need most. You bring something to the table that medical professionals can't, the perspective of someone who's actually been in the patient's position. The conversation boosted my confidence significantly, and I found myself more actively engaged in the remaining sessions. On the final day of the conference, David and I attended a panel discussion about integrating mental health support into plastic surgery practices. One of the panelists mentioned that her practice was looking to add a patient advocate to their team. Would you be interested in speaking with her? David asked quietly during the Q&A session. You think I should? I think you should explore every opportunity to see what appeals to you. After the session ended, David introduced me to Dr. Sarah Kim, who ran a reconstructive surgery practice that specialized in helping people recover from accidents, illnesses, and birth defects. David mentioned you're completing advocacy certification, Dr. Kim said. What's your background? I gave her a more detailed overview of my experience and training, and she listened with obvious interest. We've been thinking about adding advocacy services to our practice, she said. Many of our patients struggle with the emotional aspects of their recovery, and while we provide excellent medical care, we don't always have the time or expertise to address the psychological components. What would that position look like? I asked. Primarily supporting patients through their decision-making process about surgery, helping them understand what to expect during recovery, connecting them with resources and support groups, and providing ongoing emotional support throughout their treatment. The description sounded exactly like what I wanted to do. Would you be interested in discussing this further? Dr. Kim asked. I'd love to set up a formal interview to talk about the possibility of you joining our team. I'd be very interested, I said, trying to contain my excitement. Excellent. I'll have my office coordinator reach out to you next week to schedule something. As David and I flew home from Chicago, I felt energized and hopeful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I can't believe Dr. Kim offered me an interview, I said for the third time. I can believe it, David said. You made an excellent impression on everyone you met. You're knowledgeable, compassionate, and professionally trained. Any practice would be lucky to have you. It feels surreal. 6 months ago, I was so focused on what was wrong with my life, what I couldn't have, what I couldn't do. Now I'm potentially starting a career that could help other people avoid some of the psychological pain I went through. That's not surreal. That's the natural result of the work you've done to heal and grow. Do you think I should take the position if Dr. Kim offers it to me? I think you should do whatever feels right for you, David said. But I also think you'd be incredible at this work, and I think it would be fulfilling for you in ways that your current job hasn't been. As our plane descended toward home, I looked out the window at the city lights below and thought about how much my life had changed. I was still the same person who had stood in my childhood kitchen 6 months ago, letting my family's comments about my body and fertility wound me deeply. But I was also someone different. Someone who had learned to see herself through eyes of love rather than criticism. Someone who had discovered strength and vulnerability. Someone who was ready to use her experiences to help other people heal. The future felt full of possibility in a way it hadn't for years. And for the first time since our fertility struggles began, I felt genuinely excited about what lay ahead. The interview with Dr. Kim went better than I could have hoped. Her practice was exactly the kind of environment I wanted to work in, focused on helping people restore not just their physical appearance, but their confidence and sense of self after traumatic experiences. When she offered me the position 2 weeks later, I accepted immediately. "I have some news," I announced to David when he came home from work that Friday evening. "Good news, I hope?" "The best news. Dr. Kim offered me the advocacy position, and I start next month." David's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Sarah, that's incredible. How are you feeling?" "Terrified and thrilled in equal measure," I said honestly, "but mostly thrilled." "Tell me about the position." "I'll be working with patients before, during, and after their surgeries to help them navigate the emotional aspects of their recovery. Some of it will be practical, explaining procedures, connecting people with resources, helping them understand what to expect. But a lot of it will be emotional support and helping people process their experiences." "That sounds perfect for you." "I think it will be." Dr. Kim also mentioned that there might be opportunities to develop support groups and educational programs as the advocacy services expand. "You'll be amazing at this work," David said, pulling me into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." That weekend, Emma called with updates on her pregnancy. She was now 16 weeks along and had just found out she was having a boy. "Jake is over the moon about having a little brother," she reported. "He's already making plans for all the things he's going to teach him." "That's wonderful," I said, and was surprised to realize I felt nothing but genuine happiness at the news. No undertone of grief, no twinge of envy, just joy for my sister's growing family. "How are you doing with all the baby news?" Emma asked gently. "Actually, I'm doing really well with it," I said. "I think I've genuinely reached a place where I can be happy for you without it making me sad about my own situation." "That's such progress, Sarah. I'm really proud of you." "Thank you. And Emma? I want you to feel completely free to share all the details about the pregnancy and the baby. I don't want you to feel like you have to protect me from your happiness." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Your joy doesn't diminish my life. It adds to it." As we talked about Emma's baby plans and my new job, I felt profoundly grateful for how much our relationship had deepened through my healing process. Instead of my fertility struggles creating distance between us, working through them had brought us closer together. A few days later, I was cleaning out my closet when I came across the dress I'd worn to the family reunion. The flowing maxi dress I'd chosen specifically because it covered everything I wanted to hide. I held it up, remembering how self-conscious I'd felt that day, how much energy I'd put into concealing parts of myself. "Spring cleaning?" David asked, noticing the growing pile of clothes I was setting aside for donation. "Something like that. I'm getting rid of things that don't fit who I am anymore." "Like what?" I showed him the dress. "I bought this specifically to hide my body. I have at least 6 other outfits in here that I chose for the same reason. Not because I liked them, but because they concealed what I thought were flaws." "What are you replacing them with?" "Clothes I actually like. Clothes that fit well and make me feel confident instead of hidden." "That sounds like a good investment." As I continued sorting through my wardrobe, I thought about the upcoming summer and how different it would be from the previous year. Instead of dreading family gatherings and beach trips, I was looking forward to spending time with people I loved while feeling comfortable in my own skin. "David," I said as I folded a sweater I'd worn constantly because it was loose and concealing, "do you remember what you said to Aunt Patricia at the family reunion?" "I remember telling her that your fertility challenges weren't caused by your weight, and that your weight was none of her business. You also said something about how people make assumptions about women's bodies instead of listening to their actual symptoms." "I did say that. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, especially as I've been learning about patient advocacy. How often do people, medical professionals included, make assumptions about what's wrong with someone based on their appearance, rather than actually listening to what they're experiencing?" David sat down on the edge of the bed, clearly interested in the direction of the conversation. More often than we should, he said honestly. It's one of the unconscious biases that medical training tries to address, but it's still a real problem. I think that's part of what I want to work on in my advocacy role. Helping people articulate their experiences in ways that medical professionals will hear, and helping medical professionals understand the patient's perspective more completely. That could make a real difference for a lot of people. I hope so. I keep thinking about how much unnecessary shame and self-blame could be avoided if people had better support through medical challenges. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a smile. Hi, Mom, how are you? I'm wonderful, honey. I was calling because I wanted to invite you and David to a little celebration dinner next weekend. What are we celebrating? Your father's promotion to department head, Emma's pregnancy, and your new job. I thought it would be nice to have the whole family together to celebrate all the good news. The invitation would have filled me with dread 6 months ago, another family gathering where I'd feel scrutinized and found wanting. Now, it sounded lovely. We'd love to come, I said. Should we bring anything? Just yourselves. Oh, and Sarah, I wanted you to know how proud Dad and I are of you. This new career path sounds perfect for you. Thank you, Mom. That means a lot. After I hung up, David looked at me with curiosity. How do you feel about another family gathering? Excited, actually. I want to tell everyone about the new job, and I want to celebrate Emma's pregnancy properly. No anxiety about potential comments or questions? I thought about it honestly. Not really. I feel solid enough in myself now that other people's opinions or assumptions don't destabilize me the way they used to. That's remarkable progress. It is, and you know what? I think I owe Aunt Patricia a thank you. David raised an eyebrow. How so? Her inappropriate comments at the last family gathering were the catalyst for everything that's happened since. Your defense of me, our conversations about healing, my journey towards self-acceptance, my decision to pursue advocacy work, none of that would have happened if she hadn't forced the issue into the open. That's a very gracious way to look at it. I'm not saying what she did was okay, I clarified. But I'm saying that sometimes painful moments can lead to important growth if we're willing to do the work. And you've definitely done the work. As evenings settled around us, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past several months. The changes hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but they had been profound. I'd learned to see myself through eyes of love, rather than criticism. I'd discovered that my worth wasn't dependent on my ability to bear children, or achieve some impossible standard of physical perfection. I'd found a career path that felt meaningful and aligned with my values. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust David's love for me instead of constantly questioning whether I deserved it. Can I tell you something? I said as we settled into bed that night. Always. I finally understand what you meant when you said my scars represent courage rather than failure. What helped you see it that way? Learning about other people's recovery journeys through my advocacy training. When I hear stories about what people have survived and how they've rebuilt their lives, I see their scars as evidence of their strength. And if I can see it that way for other people, I should be able to see it that way for myself. And do you? I'm getting there. Some days more than others. But yes, I'm getting there. David reached over and traced one of my scars gently with his finger. These tell the story of someone who didn't give up, who kept fighting for her dreams even when it was painful. There's nothing ugly about that story. I'm starting to believe you, I said. Good, because it's true. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about the upcoming family dinner and how different it would be from the last gathering. I would be arriving as someone who knew her worth, who had found meaningful work, who could celebrate other people's joy without feeling diminished by it. I would be arriving as someone who had learned that healing wasn't about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. We're approaching the climactic moments of this epic tale, and the tension is at its peak. Creating stories of this scope and detail requires not just writing talent, but careful plotting, character development, and attention to every narrative thread. We've journeyed through nearly 40,000 words together, and I hope every moment has kept you engaged. If this story has drawn you in and kept you listening, Please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Share this epic with anyone who loves immersive storytelling, and hit that notification bell for more incredible adventures. Now, let's witness how everything comes together in these final crucial moments. The family dinner Mom had planned turned into something much larger than the intimate gathering she'd originally described. Word had spread through the extended family about Dad's promotion, Emma's pregnancy, and my new career, and by the time David and I arrived at my childhood home, cars lined the street and the house was buzzing with the energy of an impromptu celebration. "This looks like more than just immediate family," David observed as we parked behind Uncle Bob's pickup truck. "Mom always says she's planning something small, then invites everyone she can think of," I said, laughing. "I should have warned you." As we approached the front door, I realized I felt genuinely excited about seeing everyone. The anxiety that had characterized family gatherings for years was notably absent, replaced by anticipation for sharing my good news and celebrating with people I loved. "There they are," Mom's voice rang out as we entered the house. She appeared immediately, wrapping both David and me in enthusiastic hugs. "Everyone's been asking about your new job, Sarah. We're all so proud of you." The living room was packed with relatives, and as we made our way through the crowd, I found myself receiving congratulations and questions about my career change from every direction. "Patient advocacy," Aunt Linda said thoughtfully when I explained my new role. "That sounds so important. I remember when my mother was in the hospital, and nobody explained anything to us. She would have loved having someone like you to help." "Tell me more about what you'll actually be doing," Cousin Mark asked, seeming genuinely interested. As I described my work with Dr. Kim's practice, I felt a surge of professional pride. This wasn't just a job. It was a calling that felt perfectly aligned with who I was becoming. "It sounds like you'll be helping people through some of their most vulnerable moments," Emma said, appearing at my side with her growing belly prominently displayed in a cheerful yellow dress. "Exactly," I agreed, helping them understand that they're not defined by their medical challenges, that healing is about more than just physical recovery. "That's beautiful," Emma said softly, "and it sounds like it comes from a very personal place for you." "It does, in the best possible way." The evening continued with the comfortable chaos typical of Henderson family gatherings. Dad gave a modest speech about his promotion, during which he credited his success to Mom's support and his family's encouragement. Emma showed off her latest ultrasound photos, and everyone debated whether the baby would look more like Jake or Lily. As dinner was served, I found myself seated between David and Great Aunt Ruth, who immediately began interrogating me about my new career with a sharp intelligence that had made her a formidable high school principal for 40 years. "This advocacy work," she said, cutting straight to the heart of things as always, "it requires a lot of emotional strength. Are you prepared for that?" "I think so," I said honestly. My training program covered boundary setting and self-care pretty extensively, and I've done my own work on healing from medical trauma, so I understand the process from a personal perspective. "Medical trauma?" Great Aunt Ruth's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of medical trauma?" I glanced at David, who gave me an encouraging nod. I'd been wondering when and how to share more details about our fertility struggles with the extended family, and this seemed like a natural opening. "David and I went through several years of fertility treatments," I said simply. "Multiple procedures, pregnancy losses, the whole emotional roller coaster that comes with that territory." Great Aunt Ruth's expression softened immediately. "Oh, honey. I had no idea you were dealing with that." "We kept it pretty private," I explained. "But going through that experience taught me a lot about how medical challenges affect not just your body, but your sense of self, your relationships, your whole worldview. And now you want to help other people navigate similar challenges?" "Yes, different medical situations, but similar emotional territory." Great Aunt Ruth nodded approvingly. "That's what I call making meaning from suffering, turning your pain into purpose." The phrase struck me as particularly apt. I hadn't just survived my medical challenges. I had transformed them into something that could benefit other people. As dessert was being served, I noticed Aunt Patricia making her way toward our side of the table. My stomach clenched reflexively, memories of our last encounter flooding back. But instead of the defensiveness I might have felt 6 months ago, I found myself curious about what she would say. "Sarah," she said, settling into the empty chair beside me, I wanted to talk to you about this new job of yours. What about it? It sounds wonderful, she said earnestly, really meaningful work. But I also wanted to apologize again for what I said at the last family gathering. About your weight and fertility and all that. I was surprised by her directness. Thank you, Aunt Patricia. I've been thinking about it a lot since then, she continued, especially after what David said about endometriosis and how wrong I was to make assumptions. I realized I was projecting my own anxieties about getting older and my changing body onto you. This level of self-reflection was not what I'd expected from Aunt Patricia. I appreciate you telling me that, I said sincerely. I also wanted you to know that I think what you're doing, helping people through medical challenges, is exactly the kind of work the world needs more of. You're going to be wonderful at it. Thank you, I said, feeling genuinely moved by her words. That means a lot. Can I ask you something? Aunt Patricia lowered her voice slightly. How did you get through the fertility stuff? I have a friend who's struggling with similar issues, and I don't know how to help her. The question was asked with such genuine concern that I found myself responding openly. I said, and learning to trust that the people who love me, especially David, see me as valuable exactly as I am. How did you learn that? Slowly, I said with a small laugh. With a lot of support from David and therapy, and eventually realizing that I could channel my experiences into something helpful for other people. So the new job is connected to what you went through? Very much so. Not that everyone I work with will have fertility challenges, but the emotional process of healing from medical trauma has a lot of common elements, regardless of the specific situation. Aunt Patricia nodded thoughtfully. Could I give your contact information to my friend? I think she might benefit from talking to someone who's been through something similar. Of course, I said, feeling honored by the request. I'd be happy to talk with her. As Aunt Patricia moved away to rejoin other conversations, David leaned over to me. That was a very different conversation than last time, he observed quietly. It was. I think she's done some real thinking since then. How did it feel to talk openly about our fertility struggles? I considered the question. Good, actually, natural. Like it was just part of my story, rather than this shameful secret I had to protect. That's huge progress. It is. And you know what? I think I'm ready to be more open about it in general, not because I want attention or sympathy, but because there might be other people who could benefit from knowing they're not alone. As the evening wound down and people began making their departure preparations, I found myself reflecting on how different this gathering felt from the last one. Instead of feeling defensive about my body, my fertility, my choices, I felt confident in who I was and excited about my future. Instead of hiding parts of myself, I was sharing my experiences openly and finding that vulnerability created connection rather than exposure. Ready to head home? David asked as we said our final goodbyes. Almost. I want to talk to Emma for a minute first. I found Emma in the kitchen, helping Mom with the dishes despite Mom's protests that pregnant women shouldn't be doing cleanup. Emma, I said, can I talk to you for a second? Of course. She set down the dish towel and followed me to the quieter hallway. I wanted to thank you, I said. For what? For being so patient with me through all the fertility stuff. For understanding when I couldn't celebrate your pregnancies the way I wanted to. For never making me feel like my struggles were invalid just because you didn't have the same challenges. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Sarah, you never had to pretend to be okay for my sake. I know that now, but I also want you to know that I'm genuinely excited about this baby. Not conflicted excited, not forcing myself to be happy excited, just purely genuinely excited. Really? Really? I think I've finally reached a place where other people's joy adds to my life instead of highlighting what's missing from it. Emma pulled me into a hug. I'm so proud of who you've become through all of this. You could have let the fertility struggles make you bitter or closed off, but instead, you've become more compassionate and open. I had good support, I said, glancing toward the kitchen where David was helping Dad carry dishes. You did. But you also did the work. Not everyone who has good support chooses to do the healing work. As David and I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I felt a deep sense of completion. The evening had been everything I'd hoped for, an opportunity to share my good news, celebrate my family's milestones, and demonstrate to myself how much I'd changed over the past year. "How are you feeling about everything?" David asked as we merged onto the highway. "Grateful," I said without hesitation. "Grateful for the journey, even the difficult parts. Grateful for your support through all of it. Grateful for the work I get to do now. Grateful for the relationships with my family that feel deeper and more authentic than they did before. Even grateful for Aunt Patricia's inappropriate comments that started this whole process?" I laughed. "Especially grateful for that. If she hadn't forced the issue into the open, I might have continued hiding from you and from myself for years longer. What do you think the next chapter looks like?" David asked. "Professionally, I'm excited to start helping Dr. Kim's patients and hopefully developing support programs for people going through medical challenges. Personally, I want to keep building on this foundation of self-acceptance and authentic relationships." "Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" I thought about the question seriously. The fertility struggles had been genuinely painful, and there were moments I wouldn't wish on anyone. But they had also led to profound personal growth and a career that felt perfectly aligned with my values and experiences. "No regrets," I said finally. "Different choices would have led to a different life, but I can't imagine being happier with who I am or the direction I'm heading than I am right now." 6 months later, I was preparing for my first speaking engagement at a medical conference when I received an unexpected phone call. "Sarah, this is Dr. Martinez from the Chicago conference. I don't know if you remember me, but we spoke about patient advocacy and lived experience." "Of course I remember you," I said, setting down the presentation slides I'd been reviewing. "How are you?" "I'm wonderful, thank you. I'm calling because I'm organizing a panel discussion for the International Conference on Medical Trauma Recovery, and I'd love to have you participate." "What kind of panel?" "We're focusing on the intersection of personal experience and professional advocacy. The audience will be medical professionals, mental health providers, and patient advocates. We want to discuss how lived experience informs effective patient support." The invitation was both exciting and intimidating. Speaking at a national conference would be a significant step in establishing myself as a voice in the advocacy field. "What would my role be specifically?" I asked. "We'd like you to speak about your journey from patient to advocate, how your personal experiences with medical trauma informed your approach to helping others, and what medical professionals should understand about the psychological aspects of recovery." "When is the conference?" 3 months from now in Boston. We'd cover all expenses, of course, and provide an honorarium." I found myself saying yes before I'd fully processed the magnitude of the opportunity. After hanging up, I called David immediately. "That's incredible, Sarah." His enthusiasm was evident even over the phone. "A national conference panel is a huge honor." "I'm terrified," I admitted. "What if I don't have anything valuable to say to a room full of medical professionals?" "Are you kidding? You have everything valuable to say. You understand patient experience from the inside. You've done the professional training to support others effectively, and you've seen firsthand how emotional healing affects physical recovery. When you put it that way, it sounds less intimidating. Plus, you've already been doing this work with Dr. Kim's patients for 6 months. You have real experience to draw from now." David was right. In the months since starting my advocacy work, I'd supported dozens of patients through various stages of their recovery journeys. Each interaction had reinforced my understanding of how crucial emotional support was to overall healing outcomes. "Will you help me prepare for the presentation?" I asked. "It would be my honor." Over the next few weeks, David and I worked together to develop my presentation. We reviewed my patient interactions, identified common themes in effective advocacy, and crafted talking points about the integration of personal experience and professional practice. "Tell me about Mrs. Rodriguez," David said one evening as we sat at the dining room table surrounded by notes and research materials. Mrs. Rodriguez had been one of my first patients with Dr. Kim, a 45-year-old woman recovering from reconstructive surgery after a double mastectomy. She came to our first meeting convinced that the surgery had left her disfigured and unattractive, I said. She was avoiding intimacy with her husband, wearing baggy clothes, talking about feeling like, quote, damaged goods. "How did you help her?" "Initially, just by listening without trying to fix anything. She needed to express all her fears and grief before she could consider alternative perspectives. And then, I shared some of my own story, how I'd struggled with feeling damaged after my medical procedures, how I'd learned to see my scars as evidence of survival rather than failure. Not to say our situations were identical, but to show her that the feelings she was having were normal and that healing was possible. What was the turning point for her? When I introduced her to Maria, another patient who'd had similar surgery 2 years earlier. Seeing Maria living confidently, wearing clothes she loved, talking about her relationship with her husband, that showed Mrs. Rodriguez what recovery could look like. And how is she doing now? Thriving. She's become a peer support volunteer herself, helping newly diagnosed women understand their surgical options and recovery process. That's the perfect example of how advocacy creates ripple effects, David said. You helped her heal, and now she's helping others. As we continued developing the presentation, I realized how much my understanding of healing had evolved. It wasn't a linear process with a clear endpoint, but rather an ongoing journey of integration and growth. The goal wasn't to forget traumatic experiences or pretend they hadn't happened, but to transform them into sources of strength and wisdom. I want to include something about the importance of medical professionals acknowledging the whole person, not just the medical condition, I told David as we refined the presentation outline. What do you mean specifically? So many of the patients I work with feel like their medical team sees them as a collection of symptoms or surgical sites, rather than complete human beings with complex emotional lives. When healthcare providers take time to understand the patient's fears, hopes, and concerns about how their condition affects their identity and relationships, it significantly improves the therapeutic relationship. That's a crucial point. How do you think medical professionals could do that better? Simple things, really. Asking about the patient's concerns beyond just physical symptoms. Acknowledging that medical procedures can be emotionally challenging regardless of how routine they are for the medical team. Recognizing that healing involves both body and mind. You should definitely include specific examples of language that helps versus language that unintentionally dismisses emotional concerns. As the conference approached, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I had been consumed by shame about my body, convinced that my medical challenges made me somehow defective. Now I was preparing to speak to hundreds of medical professionals about how those same experiences had given me unique insights into the healing process. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic, but it had been complete. I no longer saw my scars as evidence of failure, but as proof of resilience. I was exactly who I was meant to be. As we flew home through the darkness, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had once hidden her scars and questioned her worth had become someone who helped others find their own healing. The pain hadn't been wasted. It had been transformed into purpose. David reached for my hand as the plane began its descent. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For doing the work to heal. For becoming who you were meant to be. For letting me be part of your journey." I squeezed his hand, looking out at the city lights below that would soon be home. Tomorrow I would return to my patients, to the meaningful work that had grown from my deepest struggles. I would continue building a life defined not by what I had lost, but by what I had found. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning.